They called him a saint. She came to prove it was a mask. But some masks, once you pry them off, reveal the truest face of all. And the most dangerous thing of all is the truth. Our story begins at this very moment. The chandeliers of the Wiltshire assembly rooms had been charmed to drip light the way candles never could. A slow, gold weeping that pooled on the marble and made every guest look softer than they were. Hermione hated it. She hated specifically how flattering it was. How it smoothed the hard lines off the faces of people who had spent the war on the wrong side of every door, and let them stand here now in dress robes the colour of old wine, holding flutes of something that hissed faintly against the crystal. She was not Hermione tonight. She was J. Marsh, junior columnist, a name that fit her like a borrowed coat, too loose in the shoulders, conspicuous at the cuffs. The press badge pinned to her robes carried that name in tidy gold script, and every time her eyes dropped to it, she felt the small, cold tug of something close to shame. 5 years out of the war, and this was the work she did. Gala notices, society profiles, the polite taxidermy of reputation. She had told herself it was temporary. She had been telling herself that for 11 months. Across the room, the reason she had come was laughing. Draco Malfoy did not laugh the way she remembered. The boy who had sneered down the length of a corridor had learned, somewhere, to fold his amusement into something quieter. A tilt of the head, a low murmur that drew the matron beside him into leaning closer, conspiratorial. He wore his contrition like a tailored thing. Exemplary, the prophet called him. The penitent heir. He had funded a wing of St. Mungo's, 3 orphanages, a scholarship fund that bore no family name at all. The photographs of him were always the same. Head slightly bowed, a hand pressed to his chest, eyes lowered in the universal posture of a man who knows precisely how sorry he is supposed to look. That was the part that turned her stomach. Not the crimes. Those she could at least understand as the desperate arithmetic of a frightened boy. It was the performance of having outgrown them, the seamlessness of it. No one transformed that cleanly. People carried their old selves the way she carried hers, snagged on the lining, surfacing at the worst moments. A man did not simply lay down what he had been and walk away wearing something better. So she had come to find the seam, the place where the costume had been stitched. She moved along the edge of the room, past a table where ice sculptures of phoenixes melted in slow, dignified collapse. And she watched him work the crowd, and she catalogued. The way he never let a conversation last longer than a minute and a half. The way his glass stayed full. He lifted it. He never drank. The way his gaze, between handshakes, went somewhere flat and far, like a window with the curtain drawn, before the warmth snapped back into place for the next outstretched hand. There, she thought. That's the tell. That's the rot under the... And she stopped herself, because she had promised in the small notebook of her own discipline to stop reaching for that particular phrase. It was lazy. It assumed the conclusion. A good investigator did not decide what she would find before she found it. She decided anyway. That was the trouble with old grudges. They had their own gravity. The orchestra shifted into something slower, strings sighing under a charm that made the notes hang a half beat too long in the air, and the crowd loosened, drifted, reformed. Hermione waited until he peeled away toward the long windows at the room's far end. A moment alone, the first he'd allowed himself all evening, and she went after him. He was looking out at the dark gardens when she reached him, one hand resting on the cold sill, the silver of a signet ring catching the light. Up close, the careful warmth was gone from his face entirely. What was left was tired, genuinely, structurally tired, in the way of someone who had not slept properly in years and had stopped expecting to. "Mr. Malfoy." She pitched her voice low, professional, the voice of J. Marsh. "Daily Prophet, might I ask you a few questions?" He didn't turn at once. When he did, the smile arrived first, practiced, frictionless, already half apologetic. "Of course, though I'm afraid I've said everything worth—" And then he saw her. She watched it happen, watched the smile not so much fall as stop, like a clock with a snapped spring, the hands frozen mid-gesture. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not name, a swift and complicated weather, there and gone. His hand left the windowsill. The ring clicked once against the wood as he withdrew it. "Granger," he said. It was not a question. The single word came out of him, stripped of every performance she'd just spent an hour cataloguing. Flat, almost soft, and so unlike the silk he'd been spinning for the matrons that she felt absurdly exposed, as though she were the one who had dropped a mask. "I go by J. Marsh professionally," she said. "You go by a fake name. Faint, dry. How very brave of the Prophet." The barb landed, and she let it, because beneath it she heard something else. Recognition, yes, but no alarm. He was not afraid she'd come. If anything, he looked at her with the resignation of a man watching weather he had long ago forecast. "I'd like to talk about your charitable work," she said. "The scope of it, the consistency of it." Consistency. He repeated the word as if testing its weight. "You make it sound like a symptom. I make it sound like a question." She drew breath, and the accusation she had carried in all evening came up the back of her throat, and she did the thing she always did, the thing that had made her brilliant and unbearable in equal measure. She said it plainly. "I don't believe you. Any of it. I think the galas and the donations and the lowered eyes are a very expensive way of buying a story the public would rather read than the truth. And I intend to find out what the truth is. There, out in the open, ozone sharp, the air between them gone tight as the half-second after a hex is cast and before it lands." She expected denial. She had braced for it, the wounded protest, the lawyer's smoothness, the threat veiled as concern. She had even, somewhere unflattering, wanted it, because a man defending himself shows you where he's soft. Draco did none of those things. He looked at her for a long moment, and the tired thing in his face deepened, settled, became something almost like— She would think about this later, turning it over and over against the dark of her ceiling, almost like relief. As though, after 5 years of being praised by people who had never asked, he had finally found someone willing to accuse him to his face. "You think I'm a fraud," he said quietly. "I think you're hiding something. And it hasn't occurred to you." His voice dropped further, so that the strings nearly swallowed it, and she had to lean in to catch the shape of the words, close enough now that she could smell the cold, clean scent of him under the room's heavy perfume of lilies and wax. "It hasn't once occurred to you, Granger, that a man might hide the truth, Not because it's worse than the story, but because no one wants the truth. Because they've already decided what I am. And the version they've written is so much easier for everyone to swallow than the alternative. She opened her mouth, found, for once, nothing in it. Which is it you'd prefer? He went on, and now there was an edge surfacing, fine as a wire. That I'm a villain dressing up as a saint, or that I'm exactly what I appear to be, and you've spent your evening looking for a crime that doesn't exist? That would be very convenient for you to claim. It would be the worst possible thing to claim, he said, because no one believes it, least of all you. The music swelled. Somewhere behind them, a champagne flute shattered against the marble, and a small ripple of laughter went up, and neither of them looked away. His eyes held hers with a steadiness that unnerved her precisely because she'd come prepared for evasion. She had built an entire architecture of suspicion, beam by careful beam, and he had just leaned a shoulder against it and asked her, calmly, to notice that it stood on nothing. She would not give him that. She could not. 11 months of borrowed names and society notices had hollowed something out of her. And this story, this exposure, was supposed to fill it back up. She needed him to be lying. I'm going to investigate you, she said, and she heard the tremor that crept in under the professionalism and despised it. Properly? Everything. Every donation, every gala, every name you've kept off the records. And when I find the seam in all this, there's no seam. I will write it, with my real name. Something flickered across his face at that. Her real name. And for one disorienting instant, she could not tell if it was a threat received or a wish granted. Then you'll waste a great deal of your time, he said, and discover only that I am tediously, disappointingly real. He set his untouched glass down on the sill with a small, deliberate click. But by all means, Granger, look, you'll be the first person in 5 years who's bothered to. He inclined his head, the same bow she'd watched him give the matrons, except not the same at all, because this one came with his eyes still on her, open, unguarded, almost daring. And he turned to go. She should have let him. The professional thing, the patient thing, was to let him walk and to begin tomorrow, methodically, from the records office. Instead, her hand shot out and caught his sleeve. She felt him go absolutely still. Under the fine wool, his forearm was warm, the muscle taut, the whole length of him arrested by 4 fingers and a fistful of fabric. He looked down at her hand. She looked at it too, as if it belonged to someone else. As if Marsh had reached out where Hermione never would have, and the contact ran up her arm like static off a charged door handle, sharp and unasked for, and impossible to release just yet. Why? Her voice came out wrong. She steadied it. Why does it matter to you whether I believe it? For a moment, he didn't answer. The candlelight moved on his face. His gaze came up from her hand, slow, and met hers, and whatever was behind it had stopped performing entirely. And she realized, with a lurch low in her chest, that she was about to hear something true, the first true thing of the whole gilded evening, and that some traitorous part of her had stopped wanting it to be a lie at all. His lips parted, and across the room a voice called out, bright and ruinous. "Mr. Malfoy, a photograph, sir, for the morning edition." and the mask came down over his face like a portcullis, and he drew his arm gently, irrevocably out of her grip. The Records Office of the Ministry's Charitable Oversight Bureau smelled of cold tea and older parchment, that particular dryness that catches in the back of the throat, the dust of documents no one had touched in years. Hermione had been there since it opened, and the clerk had long since stopped pretending to be helpful, retreating behind his desk with the wounded air of a man whose morning had been ambushed. She did not care. She had her quill, her notebook, and a stack of ledgers as tall as her forearm, and she had the particular clarity that came over her only when she was hunting something down. It was, she would have admitted under sufficient pressure, the closest thing to happiness she had felt in months. The borrowed name fell away in here. There were no galas to flatter, no society matrons to quote. There were only numbers, and numbers did not perform. She began, as she always began, with the assumption she meant to prove. The money goes out the front door and comes back through the cellar. That was the shape of every fraud she'd ever read about. The philanthropy, a laundry, the generosity, a meticulous fiction, the lowered eyes, a distraction from the hand moving under the table. She had only to follow the galleons far enough, and the loop would close, and there he'd be, caught in it. So she followed. The Greengrass Malfoy Foundation, a tidy, deliberately bland name, had given, over 5 years, sums that made her eyebrows climb. St. Mungo's Janus Thicky ward, refurbished entire. A scholarship fund at a Muggle-born vocational institute in Cardiff. 3 orphanages, one in Yorkshire, one outside Cork, one in the grey sprawl east of London. Each donation was logged, dated, witnessed. Each carried, in the prophet's coverage, a photograph of the penitent heir at the ribbon cutting, head bowed, that hand pressed to the breast, as if to keep the heart from showing. She cross-referenced the public announcements against the ledger entries. That was where the work was, in the seams, the gaps, the small dishonesties of accounting that no press release ever mentioned. It took her 4 hours to find the discrepancy, and when she found it, she sat very still for a long moment, because it was the wrong kind. The prophet had reported the Yorkshire orphanage gift as 4,000 galleons. The ledger recorded 6. The announcement at St. Mungo's had named 8,000. The Bureau's intake record showed 11, with a note in a clerk's cramped hand. Remainder to be applied at trustee's discretion. Donor declines acknowledgement. Declines acknowledgement. She read it 3 times. The phrase did not fit anywhere in the architecture she had built. A man buying a reputation announced more than he gave, not less. He inflated. He took out advertisements in his own honor. He did not, under any circumstance she could construct, hand over half again as much as the cameras saw, and then ask, in writing, that no one be told. There would be a reason. There was always a reason. Tax sheltering, perhaps, except the wizarding world had no income tax to shelter from. Some Gringotts arrangement then. Some leverage being built quietly out of gratitude she hadn't yet understood. She wrote the discrepancy down in her smallest hand and underlined it twice. And beneath it she wrote, "Find the angle," because there was an angle. There was always an angle. She did not write, or there isn't. She did not let herself. The clerk was watching her with new wariness now, the way one watches a kettle approaching the boil. She gathered the relevant ledgers, requested copies she had no real authority to request, and got them through the simple expedient of letting J. Marsh's press badge sit very visibly on the desk. And she left before noon with parchment enough to paper a wall. Outside, London was doing the thing London did in late autumn. A thin, persistent drizzle that wasn't quite rain, more an ambient grey wetness that beaded on her coat and would not be brushed off. She turned her collar up and walked, and she did not apparate, because she thought better on her feet, and because she had decided to go and look at the Yorkshire discrepancy with her own eyes rather than trust the page. The orphanage outside Halifax was a square Victorian building the colour of wet slate, set back from a lane behind a low stone wall furred with moss. There was nothing magical about its face at all. It sat among Muggle houses, indistinguishable, which was itself a small surprise. She had expected something grander, a monument with his money's name written all over it, however coyly. This looked like exactly what it was, a place where children lived who had nowhere else. She did not go in. She was not ready to be Hermione Granger here, and Jay. Marsh had no business inside, so she stood at the wall in the not-quite rain and watched. It was the garden that undid the first beam of her certainty. The garden was new. She could tell because the turf was still laid in visible seams, the way fresh sod is before it knits, and the beds along the south wall held plants too young for the season. Someone had warmed the soil, magically, to give them a chance. There was a swing set, ordinary and Muggle and solid. There was a small glass house, charmed faintly, so that the panes held a green warmth she could feel from the lane, and inside it she could see the bright disorder of children's hands at work. Clumsy rows of seedlings, a spilled bag of compost, a watering can on its side. None of it was in any photograph. None of it carried a plaque. There was nothing here for a camera to love. A woman came out into the garden, the matron Hermione guessed, broad and grey-haired and wrapped in a cardigan against the damp, and began coaxing the children indoors with the weary good humour of someone who did it every day. And Hermione, leaning on the cold stone, found herself doing something she had not planned. She found herself imagining him here. Not the penitent air of the photographs with his bowed head and his pressed hand. Just a man, paying for a glasshouse no one would ever credit him for, warming soil so that a clutch of orphans could watch something green come up out of the dark. She put the image down hard, the way you put down something hot. Sentiment is how they get you, she told herself. He counts on it. He counts on exactly this. The watcher at the wall moved. A clever fraud does not buy the front of the building. A clever fraud buys the garden, where it looks like no one was meant to see. But the argument had a hollow sound to it even as she made it, the hollow echo of footsteps in a corridor where no one is walking. Because she hadn't been meant to see. There was no audience here. There was only the rain and the moss and a watering can on its side and the slow, undeniable arithmetic of 11,000 galleons, given where the cameras only knew of 8. She went to see the matron after all. She told herself it was thoroughness. She did not give the name J. Marsh. "I'm a researcher," she said, which was true enough. Looking into charitable giving in the magical community. The Greengrass Malfoy Foundation has been generous to you, I understand. The matron's face did a complicated thing, softened and shuttered at the same time. "We've been very fortunate," she said carefully, "more than the public record shows, from what I've found." Hermione kept her voice light, neutral, a researcher's voice. The garden, the glass house, none of that was announced. No. The woman folded her arms. "And it won't be, if you've any decency." That stopped her. "I'm sorry." He was very clear. The matron's chin came up, protective now, fierce in the way of someone guarding a thing she has decided is precious. When he came, he said, and I'll not forget it, he said that the moment his name was on it, it stopped being for the children and started being for him. He said he'd give twice as much, never to have his picture taken again. And could we please, please, keep him out of it? She let out a breath. The prophet found out about the ribbon cutting because the foundation's solicitor let it slip, and he was furious, properly furious. He came up the next week, on his own, no robes, no fuss, and spent the whole afternoon in that glass house with the little ones showing them how to pot seedlings, and made me swear not a word would go to the papers. She looked at Hermione narrowly. "So, if you're from the papers, you can turn round and go back the way you came." The rain ticked against the window. Somewhere in the house a child laughed, high and unguarded, and another shushed it. "He came alone," Hermione said. It was not a question. She only needed to hear herself say it, to set the new fact down somewhere solid. "No press. He comes most months." The matron's voice had gone quieter, almost reluctant, as if she were betraying a confidence by being kind about him. "Brings books, sits with the ones who don't sleep. There's a boy here, lost both his parents in the war his lot." She stopped and corrected herself with visible effort. "Well, there's a boy here who won't speak to a soul, won't say a word, 2 years now. And that man sits with him in the dark and doesn't make him talk. Just sits. The boy waits for him at the window." She shook her head slowly. "Whatever he was, I don't know him as that. I know him as the one who comes when he says he will." Hermione's quill was still in her bag. She did not reach for it. She found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she did not want to write any of this down, that to write it down would be to fix it as evidence, and she was no longer certain what it was evidence of. She thanked the woman. She walked back out into the grey, and she stood again at the low stone wall for longer than she meant to, looking at the green-lit glass house and the swing moving very slightly in the wind. And she felt the careful architecture she'd carried in from London shift under her like a floor she'd thought was solid. "There's an angle," she told herself, one more time, and the words came thin now, threadbare, worn through with use. Find the angle. But standing there in the failing light, with the cold stone biting up through her gloves and the rain finding the gap at her collar, what she kept seeing was a man with no audience, alone in a small green room, teaching a silent child to push a seed into the dark and wait for it to want to live. She turned for the lane at last, and her foot had barely found the wet cobbles when she stopped short, because a figure was standing at the far end of it, motionless under a black umbrella, watching her exactly as she had spent the afternoon watching the house. And even at that distance, even through the grey, she knew the precise set of those shoulders, and she understood with a drop in her stomach that he had been there long enough to see her come out the door. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain came down between them in fine grey threads, ticking against his umbrella, beading on her coat, and the lane narrowed to the distance she would have to cross to reach him, or he her, and neither of them crossed it. Then he walked. Unhurried, the umbrella tilted just enough to keep the wet off his shoulders, his footsteps very even on the cobbles, and the closer he came, the more she could read his face, and the more she read it, the less she liked what she found there. Not anger. She had braced for anger, the way she had braced for denial at the gala, and been given something worse. What she found instead was a cold, settled disappointment, the look of a man watching a thing happen exactly as he'd predicted it would, taking no pleasure in being right. Granger. He stopped a careful arm's length away, close enough that the umbrella's shadow fell across her too, that the rain stopped finding her collar, and she resented the small mercy of it. Or is it marsh today? I find it hard to keep track. How long have you been standing there? Long enough. His grey eyes moved over her, the satchel heavy with copied ledgers, the rain in her hair, the orphanage at her back. And each thing he noticed cost her something, as if he were reading her case file off the surface of her. Long enough to watch you interrogate a 60-year-old woman who has done nothing in her life but be kind to children no one else wanted. Tell me, did you find your seam? She lifted her chin. I found a discrepancy of 3,000 galleons between what you announced and what you gave. And it's the wrong direction. The admission came out of her flat, almost angry, because she hated giving it to him, hated handing over the one fact that dismantled her own thesis. You gave more than you took credit for, considerably more. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, nothing so warm. A small, bitter acknowledgement. There it is, he said quietly. The great Hermione Granger, confronted with evidence that contradicts her conclusion. The umbrella tilted. Rain ran off its edge in a thin silver rope. And you came all the way to Halifax in the wet to make absolutely certain it was true, because you couldn't bring yourself to believe a ledger that told you something kind about me. You had to come and look at the orphanage. You had to be sure. That's what an investigator does. That's what someone does when they've already written the ending and the evidence won't cooperate. His voice didn't rise. That was the thing that got under her skin, that it never rose, that he held it level the way a man holds a glass he's determined not to spill. You wanted a cellar full of stolen gold, didn't you? You wanted a ledger that closed in a tidy loop, and instead you found a glass house. He glanced past her at the green-lit panes, and for just a moment the cold left his face entirely, and something unbearably tired took its place. So, now you'll be wondering what my angle is. The deep game, the reason a man would give in secret. Because the alternative, the boring, unglamorous, true alternative, is one you've decided in advance you won't accept. He had said it, the exact phrase she'd told herself at the wall not an hour ago. Find the angle. Hearing it in his mouth made her face go hot, and she did the thing she did when she was caught out. She went on the attack. People don't change like this, she said. Not cleanly, not completely. You were... She stopped herself a half-second too late. You were cruel, Malfoy. To me, specifically. For years. A word I won't say in front of an orphanage's wall, You carved it into the air every time you saw me. And I meant to believe that boy simply evaporated? That you woke up one morning and the cruelty was gone, and in its place was a man who warms soil for children he'll never get credit for. Her voice cracked on the last of it, and she despised the crack. No, I don't believe in clean transformations. I've never met one. People carry what they were. It snags. It comes back. The rain filled the silence he left. You're right, he said at last, and it was so quiet she almost missed it. It doesn't evaporate. She had not expected agreement. It threw her, the way his non-denials always threw her, and she stood there with her next argument half-formed and useless in her mouth. It doesn't go anywhere, he went on, and now his gaze came back to her and held, and there was no performance left in it at all, none of the gala's silk. I carry it everywhere. The boy in the dark room who won't speak. Do you know why I sit with him? Because I know what it is to have done nothing while terrible things happened in your own house, and to have no words afterward that aren't a lie. I'm not fixing him, Granger. I'm keeping him company in a place I happen to live too. He drew a breath that shook very slightly, only at the edge, and she felt the answering tremor of it somewhere under her own ribs. I didn't change because I woke up good. I changed because I couldn't survive being what I was. There's a difference. The cruelty's still in me. I just spend every day making sure it doesn't get out. That's not transformation. That's maintenance. It's the most exhausting thing I've ever done, and I'll do it until I die, and no one will ever once believe me. And the worst part, he stopped. His jaw tightened. She watched the muscle jump beneath the skin, watched him reach for control and find it, barely. The worst part, she said, before she could decide not to, is what? The worst part, he said very evenly, is that the only person who's ever bothered to look closely enough to find out is the one person in England who needs me to be guilty. It struck her exactly where he'd aimed it. She felt the breath go out of her, because it was true. That was the unbearable thing. He'd named the precise shape of the satchel on her shoulder, the 11 months of borrowed names, the hollow place this story was meant to fill. She needed him to be guilty. A guilty Malfoy was a column, a career, a return to the front page with her real name on it. A guilty Malfoy was the war's morality made tidy, the bad man punished, the order of things restored. An innocent Malfoy was nothing she knew what to do with. An innocent Malfoy was a glass house and a silent boy, and a man maintaining himself against his own ruin in the dark. And there was no headline in that. And worse, there was no safety in it. Because if he could change, then the world was not as fixed as she needed it to be, and people were not as knowable. And she might be wrong about a great many things she'd built her certainties on. Don't, she said. Her voice had gone unsteady. Don't pretend you know what I need. I don't have to pretend. He said it gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it cruelly. It's written all over you. You came here hungry, Granger. I recognize it. I spent years that hungry myself. The rain ticked on. You want me to be the villain, because then the story makes sense, and you get to be the hero who exposed me. And I am genuinely, profoundly sorry to disappoint you. But I'm not going to lie about who I am to give you a better ending. She should have had an answer. She always had an answer. She stood in the cold under the borrowed shelter of his umbrella, with the orphanage at her back and the copied ledgers dragging at her shoulder. And for the second time in 3 days, Draco Malfoy had said something true to her face and emptied her entirely of words. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he did the thing she least expected, the thing that would keep her awake again, turning it against the dark. He shifted the umbrella deliberately so that it covered her fully and left his own shoulder out in the rain. The wet darkened the fine wool at once, soaking in, and he didn't seem to notice or didn't care. "You'll catch your death out here," he said, almost roughly. And I'd rather not be blamed for that as well. The small, absurd chivalry of it broke something in her chest that the arguments hadn't touched. She looked at the rain spreading across his shoulder, at the umbrella held steady over her, and she thought, a fraud doesn't do this when there's no one to see. There was no camera on the lane. There was no prophet, no matron, no audience but the two of them and the falling grey. He was getting wet for no reason at all, except that she was getting wet, and it served no story, and it bought him nothing. "Why are you letting me investigate you?" she asked. The question came out smaller than she meant it to. "You could stop me, a man with your solicitors. You could have me reassigned, sued, buried. Why let me dig?" For a long moment he didn't answer. The water ran off the umbrella's edge between them like a beaded curtain, and his eyes searched her face as though deciding how much truth she could be trusted with. And she found she was holding her breath, waiting to be deemed worthy of it. "Because," he said finally, and his voice had dropped to something she had to lean toward to catch, close enough now that she could see the rain caught in his lashes. "In 5 years, you are the only person who has ever wanted to know who I actually am. Everyone else is satisfied with the saint or the sinner. They've got their version and they're comfortable. But you..." He stopped, and the corner of his mouth twisted, self-mocking. "You won't be comfortable until you've taken me apart and seen every piece. And as exhausting and humiliating and enraging as that is, Granger, it is also the closest thing to being seen that I have felt since the war ended. So, no, I won't stop you. Dig. Take it all apart." His breath fogged faintly in the cold. "I'd rather be known and hated than admired for a lie. At least the hatred would be honest." The rain came down. Her satchel was heavy with the evidence of his goodness. His shoulder was dark with water held for her sake. And Hermione Granger, who had come to Halifax certain of exactly one thing, found that the certainty had washed clean out of her and left behind it something far more dangerous, a wish, sudden and traitorous and entirely her own, to set the satchel down in the wet and reach up and brush the rain from his lashes with her thumb. Her hand had actually begun to rise when she caught it and curled it hard into a fist at her side. He saw. Of course he saw. He saw everything. His eyes dropped to the fist, then came back up to her face, and the air between them under the small dry shelter of the umbrella went so taut and so charged that the falling rain seemed to slow, and for one suspended instant the careful arm's length between them was the only thing in England she could feel. And then, somewhere down the lane, the orphanage door banged open and a child's voice cried out his name, bright with uncomplicated joy, and he turned toward it before she could see what his face had been about to do. The boy's name was Thomas, and he was perhaps 7, and he came pelting down the wet path with his arms already lifted, and Draco caught him without a word and swung him up onto one hip as though he weighed nothing, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. The child buried his face in the dark, wet wool of Draco's shoulder, the same shoulder the rain had soaked on her account, and said nothing at all, and Hermione understood with a small lurch that this was the boy the matron had spoken of, the one who had not spoken in 2 years, the one who waited at the window. He was not speaking now, but his small hand had fisted itself in Draco's collar with the absolute, wordless certainty of a creature who has found the one safe place in the world, and Draco's hand cradled the back of his head and his face. Hermione would carry this, she knew, for a very long time. His face had gone soft in a way no gala had ever coaxed out of it, soft and unguarded, and entirely without an audience in mind, because he had clearly forgotten she was there at all. She stood at the wall, forgotten, and watched a man she had come to destroy hold a silent child in the rain, and she felt the last load-bearing beam of her case go quietly out from under her. He remembered her a moment later. She saw it happen, saw the awareness return to his eyes, saw him brace for her to make something of it, to take notes, to turn this too into evidence of some deeper scheme. The softness didn't vanish exactly, but a wariness laid itself over it, the wariness of a man who has been caught with his guard down by precisely the wrong person. "Granger," he said low. "This is Thomas. Thomas, this is a researcher." The boy turned his head just enough to look at her with one solemn grey eye. She had the strangest sensation of being assessed and of falling somewhat short. "Hello, Thomas," she said, and was surprised at how gentle her own voice came out. He did not answer, of course. But he did not hide his face again either, and the matron, hurrying down the path with a coat held over her head, said breathlessly, "There you are, you wicked thing, out in the wet." And then, seeing Draco, stopped, and her whole face rearranged itself into something Hermione could only call relief. "Oh, it's you. He's been at that window since breakfast." "I'm a day early," Draco said. "I'll take him in." And he did. He carried the boy up the path and through the door, and Hermione stood in the rain with her satchel and was not invited to follow, and she found she minded that far more than she had any right to. She did not write the story. That was the first thing that changed, and it changed quietly, without any decision she could point to afterward. She went back to London with a satchel full of evidence, and she did not write a word of it. And when her editor, a heavy, restless man named Cormac Pruitt, with ink-stained cuffs and an appetite for ruin that had kept the profit circulation high, asked her where the Malfoy piece was, she heard herself say that the investigation was ongoing. Ongoing. Pruitt rolled the word around like something gone off. "It's been a fortnight, Marsh. The man's a war criminal playing dress-up as Father Christmas. How hard can it be to find the rot under the—" "There isn't any," she said. The words were out before she could weigh them. Pruitt's small eyes came up sharp. "There isn't any— what?" "Any rot, any fraud, any cellar full of stolen gold." She kept her voice level, professional, Jay. Marsh's voice, though her heart was going hard. I've followed the money through 5 years of ledgers. He gives more than he announces. He demands his name be kept off it. There's no scheme, Cormac. There's just a man giving away money and asking no one to notice. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, ugly sound. And you believe that? I believe the ledgers. Ledgers. He waved a hand as if at a fly. Ledgers can be made to say anything. You want the truth? You don't follow the money. You follow the want. What does a Malfoy want? Rehabilitation. The whole world purring at his feet, all forgiven, the slate wiped. He leaned across the desk, and she caught the stale smell of his pipe. That's the story. Not is the saint a fraud. Every reader's already decided he is. They just want it confirmed. You go find me one person. One who'll say on the record that it's all an act. You find me a wronged family, a bitter house elf, a jilted whatever. We build it from there. He sat back. Truth's a starting position, Marsh, not a finish line. She left his office with her stomach turning and the satchel still heavy on her shoulder, and she understood for the first time, with real clarity, what she had walked into the middle of. The prophet did not want to know whether Draco Malfoy was good or bad. The prophet had already sold the answer. It only needed her to go out and dress it. And the worst of it, the part that kept her standing in the corridor outside Pruitt's door long after he'd shut it, was that 2 weeks ago she'd have agreed with him. Follow the want. She'd have nodded along. She had come to the gala doing exactly that. She had decided the ending and gone looking for the evidence to fit it. No better than Pruitt, only better read. She wrote to Draco that night, not as Marsh, as herself in her own slanting hand, on her own plain parchment, and she did not entirely understand why, except that the satchel of evidence felt like a thing she had stolen and ought to return. I'm not going to write the story, she wrote. There isn't one, not the one I came for. I owe you that much, plainly said. She paused, the quill dripping, and then, before she could stop herself, but I find I still want to understand it, not for a column, for myself. You said I was the only person who wanted to know who you actually are. I'd like to finish knowing, if you'll let me. She read it back. It was the most honest thing she'd written in 11 months, and it terrified her, and she sent it before the fear could win. His reply came at dawn, by an owl the colour of ash, and it was very short. The Manor Archive. Saturday. Come as Granger. The other one isn't welcome, but she never really was she? The manor was not what she remembered, and she had not expected the relief of that. She had braced herself. She'd had to, riding the long drive up through the dripping yews, for the house where she had screamed on a drawing-room floor while a knife came down toward her throat. But the drawing-room, when a quiet house elf led her past its door, stood empty and stripped, the carpet gone, the walls bare plaster, a room mid-demolition. Draco saw her looking. I'm taking it apart, he said. He stood in the archive doorway in a plain dark jumper, no robes, no signet ring she could see, and the lack of armour made him look younger and far less certain. Room by room. I can't burn the place down. There are house elves who've nowhere else, and the ministry has its hooks in the wards. But I can unmake the rooms where the worst of it happened, brick by brick if I have to. A muscle moved in his jaw. It's slow, but it's mine to do. She had no answer to that. She followed him into the archive. It was a long, high room, lined floor to ceiling with shelves, and every shelf was full, not of dark grimoires, as some buried part of her had still half expected, but of files, folders, ledgers, boxes labelled in his precise hand. 5 years of giving, documented and ordered and hidden from the world. "You wanted to take me apart," he said, and gestured at the whole vast room with a kind of weary defiance. "Here I am. Every galleon, every letter, every name I kept off the records. I haven't shown this to a living soul." He looked at her, and the wariness was there, but under it something else, something that cost him visibly to offer. "I don't know why I'm trusting you with it. You came to ruin me a fortnight ago." "I know," she said quietly. "I don't entirely understand it either." They worked. That was how the afternoon unspooled, not in confrontation, but in the strange intimacy of shared labour, the two of them at a long oak table with the rain on the high windows and a single lamp pooling gold over the parchment between them. He passed her files. She read. She asked questions and he answered them, plainly without performance, and the careful arm's length of the lane shrank, hour by hour, to the width of a tabletop, then to the width of a past folder, then to nothing she could measure at all. She read letters he had written to families of the dead, not the famous dead, the small ones, the forgotten ones, a shopkeeper here, a muggle-born clerk there. Letters offering money, anonymous, no strings, because I was in the house when it happened, and I did nothing, and there is no apology adequate to that, so I will not insult you with one. Only this. She read the replies. Some were gracious, many were not. One was a single line. "Keep your blood money, Malfoy." And she found it pressed flat and kept, the cruelest of them all, the one he had chosen to save. "Why keep that one?" she asked. Her voice had gone thick. He didn't look up from the file in his hands. "Because it's the honest one," he said. "The rest forgave me to be polite. That one meant it." His thumb moved once over the edge of the parchment. "I read it when I start to think I've done enough. It reminds me I haven't." She looked at his hands on the letter, the long pale fingers, the absence of the signet ring he'd worn at the gala, set aside somewhere along with the rest of the armour. And she felt the want rise in her again, the same traitorous wish from the rain-soaked lane. And this time there was no umbrella and no audience and no child to interrupt it, only the lamp and the rain and the warm, narrow space across the table. She reached out, not for a file, for his hand. She didn't decide to. Her fingers simply moved across the oak and came to rest, very lightly, over the back of his hand where it lay on the cruel letter. And she felt him go utterly still, exactly as he had at the gala when she'd caught his sleeve, the whole length of him arrested by the smallest contact. And beneath her palm his hand was warm and not quite steady and did not pull away. The lamp hissed. The rain ran down the high, dark glass. Neither of them breathed. Slowly, so slowly she could have stopped it a dozen times and did not. His hand turned beneath hers, palm coming up to meet palm, his fingers curling to hold rather than be held, and the warmth of it ran straight up her arm and into her chest like current finding earth. And he lifted his eyes from their joined hands to her face with an expression so naked, so frightened, so unbearably hopeful that her breath caught in her throat and held there. and the small space between them across the lamplit table began, by some gravity neither of them named, to close. She pulled back. Not far, only enough to take her hand from his, to set both palms flat on the cool oak and feel the grain of it under her skin and remember who she was and where she stood. The lamp threw their shadows long against the shelves. His hand stayed where she'd left it, open on the table, fingers slightly curled around the warmth that wasn't there anymore, and he did not reach after her. And the restraint of that, the way he simply let her go, was worse than any pursuit would have been. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't." His voice was rough at the edges. "Don't apologize. I'd rather you didn't do a thing and mean it than do a thing and take it back." He drew his hand off the table at last, slowly, and folded it with the other in his lap, putting them away like instruments he no longer trusted himself to use. "We should keep working." So they kept working, and the air between them stayed charged the way a room stays charged after lightning. Every past file a small negotiation, every accidental brush of fingers a thing they both pretended not to notice. The rain went on against the high windows. The afternoon bled toward evening. It was Hermione who found it. She had worked her way to the far end of a shelf he hadn't directed her to. Old habit, the investigator's instinct to go where she wasn't pointed. And there, behind a row of ordinary foundation ledgers, pushed back against the wall as though to be forgotten, was a box without a label. Just a plain wooden box, the wood dark with handling, a small brass clasp gone green at the edges. "Granger," his voice sharp from across the room. "Not that one." She had already opened it. She knew at once she should close it. She knew it the way you know you've stepped on ice that won't hold. Too late, the surface already giving. But she had spent her whole life unable to look away from the one thing she'd been told not to see. And so she looked, and what was inside the box was not money and not letters to strangers. It was him, the whole of him, the private wreckage of him, kept in a box behind the public good. A healer's correspondence, folded small. Mr. Malfoy, regarding our sessions and the recurring difficulty with sleep. Years of it, the dates running back almost to the war's end and forward to last month. A list in his own hand, headed only Oed. That was not a list of galleons, but of names. Dozens of them, with notes beside each. Did nothing, watched, should have spoken, too afraid. A private ledger of a different debt entirely, one no donation could ever pay down. And beneath that, at the very bottom, a single photograph, not magical, perfectly still. A younger Draco, perhaps 19, gaunt and grey and hollow-eyed, standing in the wreck of a garden, and on the back, in his slanting hand, a date and 4 words. The day I decided. She didn't ask. Decided what? She didn't have to. She had seen too many of those healers' letters about sleep, and she understood, with a cold drop straight through her, that the box held the record of a man who had come very near to not surviving what he'd been, and had chosen, on a particular day in a ruined garden, to live and to spend that life paying, and had then locked the whole proof of it away where no admiring public and no hungry reporter would ever find it, because even his survival he refused to wear for an audience. The mask was the face. She had said it to herself as a theory at the Halifax wall, half believing it, looking for the angle. Now it sat open in her hands, undeniable. And there was no angle. There'd never been an angle. There was only a person, wounded and trying and exhausted, and good in the hard, unglamorous, daily way that no one would ever put on a front page because it didn't make a story. It only made a life. "I asked you not to," he said. He was standing. She hadn't heard him cross the room. He stood at the end of the table with his hands at his sides, and his face had gone white and very still, and she understood that she had just done to him the exact thing she'd spent a fortnight failing to do. She had taken him apart and seen every piece, except that she had done it without permission in the one place he'd kept locked, and the seeing had not exposed a fraud, but laid bare the most defenseless truth a person owns. Draco. His name, his given name, came out of her without her deciding to use it. "I didn't." "Put it down." Quiet, shaking. "Please." She put it down. She closed the lid, fastened the green brass clasp, set the box on the table between them, as gently as if it held something that breathed. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time he didn't tell her not to be, and the not telling was its own kind of wound. He looked at the box for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone hollow, the hollow echo of a corridor where everyone has left. "That's what you came for, isn't it?" It wasn't an accusation. It was almost a surrender. Not the fraud. The fraud was never going to pay. This is the story. The penitent heir, mad with guilt, healers and lists, and a photograph of himself half dead in a garden. Cormac Pruitt would burn down the ministry for a box like that. His mouth twisted. "You don't even need to lie. You just print what's true. That's the cruelest version, Granger. The one where you don't have to invent a thing. You just open the box and let them watch. I'm not going to print it. You said that about the ledgers. And I didn't print the ledgers." She came around the table toward him, and he stepped back, and she stopped, the rejection landing in her chest like a struck bell. "Draco, listen to me. I came here as myself, not as Marsh. I told my editor there was no story, and I meant it, and there is no version of this that I will ever. You don't know that." His control was fraying now, the level voice climbing despite him, and she watched his knuckles whiten where his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "You don't know what you'll do when Pruitt puts the byline in front of you. Your real name, Granger. Front page. Everything you've been trying to claw back for a year, handed over for the price of one box." He shook his head, slow, the bitterness rising in him like water. "I trusted you. I showed you the archive, and the first thing you did was go straight to the corner I told you not to, because you cannot, you have never been able to, leave a locked thing locked. It was true, and it was unfair, and both at once. And she stood there absorbing it because she had earned every word. "You're right," she said. "I went where you told me not to. That's exactly who I am, and I won't pretend otherwise." She drew a breath. "But hear the rest of it. I am also the person who has known for a fortnight that you're innocent and has written nothing, who has lied to her editor to protect you, who sat across this table all afternoon and learned that you keep the cruelest letter to remind yourself you haven't done enough. And do you know what I felt, Draco? Not triumph. Not, there's my story. I felt..." Her voice broke, and she let it break. I felt that I had spent 11 months under a false name, writing about people I despised, and that this was the first afternoon in a year I'd spent with someone I... She stopped. The word hung there, unsaid, enormous. He had gone very still again. The fraying control, the bitterness, all of it suspended, and his grey eyes searched her face with a desperate, disbelieving intensity, as though he'd misheard, as though he didn't dare finish the sentence for her in case he'd got it wrong. "Someone you what?" he said. Barely a whisper. The rain came down the high windows. The lamp burned low. The box sat closed between them, the whole private truth of him fastened under green brass, and she understood that the only thing she could possibly say now was the very last thing she had come into his life intending to say. "Someone I didn't want to leave," she said. It was not the whole of it. They both knew it was not the whole of it. But it was as much as she could carry across the space between them without breaking, and she watched it land on him, watched something in his face crack open. Not the bitterness, not the fear, but a hope so raw and so long-starved that it was almost terrible to witness. The hope of a man who had armoured himself against ever being wanted precisely because he was certain he never would be. He took a step toward her. Just one. The arm's length closed to nothing. "Granger," he said, unsteady. "Hermione, if you're going to take this back too, take it back now, before I..." He stopped. His hand came up, hovered, hung in the air between them, not yet touching, his fingers a breath from her cheek and trembling with the effort of not. "Because I don't think I can survive you doing it after." She did not take it back. She turned her face the last fraction of an inch into his palm, and his hand closed against her cheek, warm and shaking, and his breath went out of him all at once, like something released after years of being held, and his thumb moved once across her cheekbone, and the whole charged length of the afternoon gathered itself into the few inches of dark, lamplit air still left between his mouth and hers as he bent toward her at last. And the archive door banged open, and the house elf's reedy voice cried, "Master, the man from the prophet is at the gates. He is saying he will not leave. He is saying he knows Miss is here." And Draco's hand stilled against her cheek, and over the elf's shoulder, framed in the doorway and dripping rain onto the ancient floor, stood Cormac Pruitt with a photographer at his back and a smile like a wound opening. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Draco's hand was still at her cheek. The photographer's flashbulb caught the light, and Hermione saw, with the cold precision of someone watching a disaster arrive in slow motion, exactly what the picture would look like in tomorrow's edition. The penitent heir and the unknown woman in the locked archive of Malfoy Manor, his hand against her face, the intimacy undeniable. Then she moved. She stepped back from Draco so fast that his hand fell into empty air, and she put the width of the table between them, and she heard herself say in J. Marsh's voice, flat and professional and utterly false, "Mr. Pruitt, I was just finishing the interview." The word interview did what she'd meant it to do, and something she hadn't. Pruitt's wound of a smile widened. But beside her, she felt, rather than saw, Draco go rigid, saw, at the edge of her vision, the colour drain out of his face, because she had just, in the space of 3 words, turned the most defenceless moment of his life into a job. She had reached for the lie out of pure animal instinct to protect them both from the camera, and in reaching for it, she had handed him the exact betrayal he'd predicted in the lane. An interview. Pruitt came into the room, his wet boots leaving dark prints on the floor, his small eyes moving from her to Draco to the closed box on the table with the avid hunger she had come to recognize. Funny, Granger doesn't usually conduct interviews with her hand on the subject's face. He let that sit. Yes, I know who you are. Took me a fortnight, but I keep files too, Marsh. Hermione Granger, war heroine, writing society puff under a fake name and stonewalling me on the biggest reputation story of the year. He turned to Draco, and his voice went oily with false warmth. Mr. Malfoy, I do apologize for the intrusion, but when one's own reporter goes quiet on a story this size, one starts to wonder whether she's been compromised. Get out of my house, Draco said. It came out very low and very even, the dangerous evenness she'd heard in the lane, and Hermione knew that voice cost him everything to keep level. She did not look at him. She could not. She knew that if she looked at him, she would see the moment the archive door had opened, his hand at her cheek, the hope raw on his face, and she would see what she'd done to it 3 words later. I'll go, Pruitt said comfortably. I've got what I came for. He nodded at the photographer, who was already backing toward the door with the look of a man clutching something priceless. A picture's 1,000 words, isn't it? Though I'll only need about 800. He paused in the doorway. Granger, my office, 9 o'clock. We'll discuss your future, such as it is. And then to Draco, with a small mocking inclination of the head. Mr. Malfoy, always a pleasure to watch a saint melt. The door closed. The wet boot prints gleamed on the floor. The rain went on, and the silence that came down then was the worst Hermione had ever stood inside. She made herself turn. Draco was looking at the closed door, his profile carved and white, and when he finally spoke, he did not look at her at all. An interview, he said. Draco, you had your hand on my face, still to the door, still not turning. And the second the camera came, it became an interview. His voice was terribly quiet. I want to understand. Help me understand. Was the afternoon an interview too? The archive? The box you weren't supposed to open? Was it all... Was I being worked, Granger, this whole time? And the only difference is that you do it more gently than Pruitt. No. The word tore out of her. No. You know that's not... I don't know anything. He turned at last, and his face had closed over completely, the portcullis down, the gala mask back in place, except infinitely worse, because she had seen what it was hiding, and now watched it come back over the truth like a stone rolled across a grave. I told you. I told you in the rain. I said you would hand it all over for a byline the moment Pruitt put it in front of you, and you said no version of this. And the first chance you got, the very first second, you called it an interview. His knuckles whitened. You protected the lie, Granger. Not me. The lie. The instinct was already there, fully formed. You reached for it before you thought. That tells me everything about which one of us you'd choose. I reached for it to protect you, by calling the realest moment of my life a job. His voice cracked, finally, on the last word, and the crack was worse than any shout. Do you have any idea? No. No, you don't. You can't. You've spent your whole life being believed. You walk into a room and people assume you're telling the truth because you're Hermione Granger and you saved the world. The bitterness was rising in him now, dark and fast, and she watched it take him the way she'd watched it, nearly take him over the kept letter, only there was no catching it this time. I walk into a room and they assume I'm lying, even when I'm not, especially when I'm not. And the one person in 5 years who I let see the truth, looked a camera in the eye and chose the lie without a second's hesitation. So forgive me if I find it difficult to believe the rest of it. The hand, the thing you didn't take back. His mouth twisted. You took it back. You took it back faster than anyone's ever taken anything back from me. Each word found its mark, because each word was, in some terrible partial way, true. She had reached for the lie. The instinct had been there, fully formed before thought. That was the cruelty of it. That her oldest reflex, the journalist's reflex, the survivor's reflex, the reflex of a woman who had been performing a borrowed name for 11 months, had betrayed in one syllable what an entire afternoon of honesty had built. And she could have defended herself. She was good at that. She could have laid out the logic, the photograph, the wards, the only way to stop the picture being worse. And it would even have been correct. But she looked at his white closed face, at the gravestone mask come back down as the man she'd watched hold a silent child in the rain, and she understood that being correct was not the same as being right, and that he did not need her arguments. He needed the one thing she had failed to give him at the exact moment it mattered. "You're right," she said. He blinked. It stopped him, the agreement where he'd braced for the defense. "I reached for the lie," she said, "before I thought. You're completely right about that. And I'm not going to stand here and explain it away, because the explanation doesn't matter. What matters is that in the 1 second it counted, my first instinct was to protect myself, and I dressed it up as protecting you, and you felt the difference instantly, because you've spent 5 years learning to feel exactly that difference." Her voice was unsteady, and she let it be. "I have spent my whole life being believed. You're right about that too. And it has made me careless. Careless with the truth. Careless with what it costs the people who aren't believed. I called it an interview because some old frightened part of me would rather be a reporter caught working than a woman caught." She stopped, made herself finish it. "Caught wanting you, because the reporter is someone I know how to be, and the woman terrifies me." The rain came down the high glass. He said nothing, but the portcullis had not come further down, and that was something. "I'm not going to ask you to believe me," she went on. "You'd be a fool to, on the strength of one ruined afternoon. So, I'm not going to ask. I'm going to show you, the only way that means anything." She lifted her chin. "I'm going to Pruitt's office at 9 o'clock. And I'm going to kill the story. Not stall it. Kill it. And when he tells me he'll run it anyway, with or without me, with that photograph and 800 words of poison." Her voice steadied into something hard and certain. The old Hermione, the one who had walked into a ministry full of Death Eaters because it was the right thing to do. "Then I'm going to do something that will make absolutely certain he can never use that picture against you. Granger, I don't know what yet, she admitted, but I'll find it. It's the one thing I've always been good at, finding the thing that's locked. She held his eyes across the ruined space between them. You said you'd rather be known and hated than admired for a lie. Let me be the version of myself I'd rather be too. Known, even if it costs me the believing, even if it costs me the name. She drew a breath, especially then, because that's the only proof you'll accept, isn't it? The kind that costs me something. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. The mask was still there, but behind it, in his eyes, something flickered. Not trust, not yet. It was far too soon for trust. But the possibility of it, the first hairline crack in the stone, the smallest reluctant willingness to wait and see. And if I don't believe you even then, he said quietly, if you burn it all down and I still can't, then I'll have done the right thing anyway, she said, and that will have to be enough. It was, she would realize later, the most honest thing she had ever said to anyone, that she would do right by him whether or not it won her anything, that the doing was the point and the winning only the hope. And she saw it reach him, saw the crack widen by a fraction, saw him open his mouth to answer. He never got the chance. Somewhere far below in the great empty house, a bell began to toll. The wards, the elf, some alarm she didn't know the meaning of. And Draco's head came up sharply, and the wariness flooded back into his face. And he said, in a voice gone suddenly cold, with a fear that had nothing to do with her, "That's the perimeter ward. Someone's come back. Pruitt doesn't have the password to ring that bell." He was already moving toward the door, and he stopped on the threshold and looked back at her. And for one bare, unguarded instant, the mask was gone again, and there was only the man, frightened and reaching. "Stay here. Whatever you hear, Hermione, whatever you hear from below, do not come down." She came down, of course. She gave him a 30-second start, and then she went after him, because she had never in her life done what she was told when someone she cared about was walking toward danger, and because the bell was still tolling through the great cold house with a sound like something grieving. She followed it down the demolished staircase, past the stripped drawing room, into the entrance hall. And there she stopped, one hand on the cold stone banister, because the scene below was not what she had braced for. There were two figures in the doorway, Rain at their backs, and neither was Pruitt. One was a woman, thin and elegant and silver blonde, in travelling robes beaded with wet, and Hermione knew her after a moment with a small shock as Astoria Greengrass, the Foundation's other name, the Greengrass in Greengrass Malfoy. She had assumed, vaguely, the way the public assumed, that the partnership was a marriage or a courtship or some genteel pureblood arrangement. The papers had hinted at it for years, the saint and his suitable lady. The other figure, half behind Astoria, was a man Hermione didn't know at all, older, broad, with a healer's clasp at his throat and a black bag in his hand. Draco. Astoria's voice was sharp with worry. "I came as soon as the elf's message reached me. It's Thomas." Hermione watched Draco's whole body change, the wariness, the fear of exposure, all of it falling away in an instant, replaced by something single and urgent. "What's happened?" "He stopped eating 2 days ago. He won't leave the window." Astoria pushed her wet hair back. "The matron's frantic. She thinks..." Draco. She thinks he's given up. Children do sometimes, the ones who've lost too much. They simply decide not to. She stopped. He keeps writing one word on the glass with his finger in the fog of his breath. The same word, over and over. Your name. He thinks you're not coming back. The elf overheard the man from the prophet at the gates shouting that he'd ruin you, and the boy heard it too. And now he's convinced. Draco was already pulling on the coat the elf held out, already turning toward the door. He stopped only when he saw Hermione on the stairs. For a moment they looked at each other across the cold hall. The woman who had come to ruin him, the man whose life was on display in pieces, the wreckage of the archive between them. And Hermione saw him make a calculation. He could leave her here, in his half-demolished house, with the archive unguarded, and the box behind the green brass clasp, and Pruitt's photograph already on its way to the presses. Every reason he had to distrust her stood in that hall, given form. "Come with me," he said. She came. The orphanage was dark when they arrived, the windows black except one, on the second floor, lit faint and gold, and at it a small shape, motionless, a hand pressed to the glass. The matron met them at the door with her face grey from sleeplessness. "He won't take anything. Not from me, not from the healer. He just—" She broke off. "He's been waiting for you. 2 days at that window." Draco went up the stairs 2 at a time. Hermione followed, slower, and stopped in the doorway of the small room, and what she saw there she would carry for the rest of her life. The boy was at the window, exactly as described, his breath fogging the cold glass, and in the fog he had drawn a wavering letter with one finger, the beginning of a name. He did not turn when the door opened. He had stopped turning, perhaps, for anyone. But Draco crossed the room and crouched down beside him, slow, careful, the way you approach a wild thing. And he did not say, "I'm here." And he did not say, "Don't be afraid." And he did not make a single one of the noises adults make to frighten children. He simply put his back against the wall beneath the window and sat down on the cold floor, and he reached up and pressed his own palm flat to the glass beside the boy's small hand, and he waited. He didn't make him talk. The matron had said it weeks ago at the wall in the rain. He doesn't make him talk, he just sits. And Hermione had filed it away as a kindness. She understood now that it was more than kindness. It was the thing Draco himself had needed and never been given. The company of someone who did not require him to perform his recovery, who would simply be in the dark with him and let the dark be dark. The boy looked at the man's hand on the glass beside his own, and then, slowly, with the terrible hesitancy of a creature deciding whether the world was safe enough to want things in, he turned from the window and put his face against Draco's chest, and his small shoulders began to shake, and Draco's arms came around him and held on, and over the boy's head Draco shut his eyes, and Hermione saw a single tear track down the carved white face of the penitent heir where no camera would ever catch it. And then the boy spoke. It was one word, muffled in the wool of Draco's coat, cracked and rusty from 2 years of silence, so quiet that Hermione barely caught it. But she caught it. The whole room caught it. The matron's hand flew to her mouth. "Stay," the boy said. Draco's arms tightened. "I'm staying," he said, his voice gone to wreckage. "I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Hermione stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to the frame, and she understood, fully and finally, and past any possibility of unknowing it, that there had never been a story to write, because the truth was this: a broken man holding a broken child in the dark, neither of them performing, neither of them watched, the realest thing she had ever witnessed, and the one thing that could never, ever go on a front page without being destroyed in the process. And she understood, with the same completeness, that she loved him, not the saint, and not the sinner, and not the story, the man on the floor with the rusty-voiced child in his arms. That one, entirely. They did not speak of it on the way back. There was nothing to say that the orphanage hadn't already said. But in the dark of the carriage Astoria had left for them, his hand found hers on the seat between them, and she turned her palm up to meet it, and they rode through the rain with their fingers laced, and said nothing at all, and it was the most that had ever been said. It was only at the manor gates, as the carriage slowed, that he spoke. "Astoria isn't—" he started and stopped and tried again. "The papers have us as a couple. We never corrected it. It was useful in a way. It kept a certain kind of attention off both of us. But she's my partner in the foundation, nothing else. Her sister married a muggle. She knows what it is to be the family that's supposed to behave a certain way and doesn't." He looked at their joined hands. "I'm telling you, because I don't want you walking into Pruitt's office tomorrow thinking there's a single thing about me you don't know. There isn't now. You've seen all of it. The archive, the box, the boy. There's nothing left locked." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "It's the most frightening thing I've ever done, letting that be true." "I know," she said. "Pruitt will run the photograph." It wasn't a question. Tomorrow or the next day, the penitent heir and the mystery woman. He'll dig until he finds your real name, and then it'll be the war heroine and the Death Eater, and he'll make it filthy, and there's nothing. "There's one thing," Hermione said. He looked at her. "I've been turning it over since the archive." Her mind had been working the whole dark ride, under the held hands and the silence, the way it always worked, finding the locked thing. Pruitt's power is the secret, the mystery woman, the hand on your face that nobody can explain. He sells the scandal of it, the saint exposed in a private moment, the public truth versus the hidden one. She turned to face him fully. "So, I take the secret away. I take all of it. There's no scandal in a thing that isn't hidden, Draco. There's no exposé of a truth that's already been told. What are you? I'm going to write the story." She watched the fear leap into his face and pressed on before it could take hold. "Not Pruitt's story. The true one. The ledgers, the orphanages, the giving you hid, the man you actually are. All of it under my own name, Hermione Granger, before he can run a single line. I take it to a paper that isn't the Prophet. I tell the whole truth so completely and so publicly that when Pruitt's filth comes out the day after, every reader in Britain has already read mine, and his photograph isn't an exposé anymore. It's just a picture of two people who've already told the world exactly who they are." She held his eyes. "He can't expose a thing that's standing in the open. I burned down the secret, so he's got nothing left to sell." For a long moment, Draco said nothing. The rain ticked on the carriage roof. And then, slowly, the fear in his face gave way to something else. Disbelief. And behind the disbelief, dawning, the thing he had not let himself feel in 5 years. "You'd put your name on it," he said. "The real one, after 11 months hiding behind a false one. You'd come back to the front page, to be believed again. And the first thing you'd do with it is spend the whole of that belief on me." His voice was barely there. "Why?" "Because you'd rather be known and hated than admired for a lie," she said. "So would I. I've been admired for a lie for a year, Draco. I'm done with it." She lifted her free hand and laid it against his jaw, the way she had in the archive, except that this time the camera was nowhere, and the lie was nowhere, and there was nothing left between her palm and his skin but the truth of it. "Let me tell them who you are. Let me be the one who finally—" The carriage door swung open. The elf stood there in the rain, wringing its hands, its great eyes wide with distress. "Master, miss, there is an owl come from the prophet, marked urgent, and it is saying—" The creature's voice shook. "It is saying the morning edition is already at the presses, and the photograph is on the front, and the headline when the elf finally got it out was worse than she'd imagined, and exactly as ugly as she'd feared. Saint or sinner? Malfoy's secret woman. And what she was doing in his locked archive." The photograph filled half the page. Draco's hand at her face, the box on the table, the intimacy turned filthy by the caption. Pruitt had moved faster than any of them. He hadn't waited for 9 o'clock. He'd never intended to. Draco read it over her shoulder in the carriage by wandlight, and she felt him go still, and she understood what he was feeling, because she'd predicted it in the lane 2 weeks ago, in the rain, when she'd been the one threatening him. The betrayal arriving precisely on schedule, even though it wasn't hers, even though she'd done nothing. The shape of the thing he'd braced against his whole life had come true on the front page, and it did not matter that she was innocent of it, because the fear was older than the facts. "It's done," he said. His voice had gone flat and far, the curtain drawn across the window. "He's run it. Your name's not in it yet, but it will be by the evening edition. The war heroine and the Death Eater in the locked room." He folded the paper with terrible care. "There's nothing to burn down now, Granger. The secret's out. Your plan—" "My plan still works." She was already moving, already out of the carriage into the rain, her mind going at the speed it only reached when everything was on fire. "Listen to me. Pruitt ran the scandal, the mystery, the locked door. But he doesn't have the truth. He doesn't have the ledgers, the orphanages, the giving you hid, the why. He's got a photograph and an insinuation. That's all he's ever had. The truth is still mine to tell, and the moment I tell it, his photograph stops being a scandal and starts being evidence. For you, not against." She turned to him in the downpour, rain streaming off them both, no umbrella now, neither of them caring. He showed his hand too early. He thought speed would win. But speed only matters if the thing you're racing toward is a secret, and I'm about to make it the opposite of a secret. I'm going to make it the most public truth in Britain. It's the middle of the night. I know every editor in this country, she said. And there are 3 who'd give their right arm for a Hermione Granger byline and have no love for Cormac Pruitt. I'm going to wake all 3. She gripped his arms. Draco, the Prophet's evening edition comes out at 5. I have until then to tell the whole truth so completely that his version drowns. I can do this. It's the one thing I have never once failed at. Let me. He looked at her in the rain, soaked through, his hair flat to his skull, the gala saint gone entirely, and only the man left, frightened and disbelieving, and hoping against everything he knew. And when it costs you, he said. When Pruitt spends the rest of his career making sure no one ever trusts Hermione Granger again. When they say you were compromised, that you fell for the man you were sent to expose, that your judgment's gone, then they'll be half right, she said. Because I did fall for you, and the rest they can choke on. She pressed the words into him through her grip on his arms. I am not asking your permission anymore. I'm telling you what I'm going to do, and you can stand here and be afraid I'll betray you, or you can come with me and watch me not. Your choice, but I'm going either way. For a long moment, the rain was the only sound. Then Draco Malfoy did the thing he had not done in 5 years. The thing the box behind the green brass clasp said he had nearly not survived long enough to do. He chose to believe someone. I'm coming with you, he said. The night that followed she would remember in fragments, lit by hearth fire and wand light, fueled by cold tea gone bitter at the bottom of the cup. She woke Gwendolen Achterberg, editor of the Sentinel, at 1:30, and stood dripping on the woman's hearthrug and laid it out. The whole of it, the ledgers from the bureau, the discrepancies in the wrong direction, the matron's testimony, the glass house, the boy, not the box. Never the box. That stayed locked, and Draco watched her leave it out, and something eased in his face that no amount of telling could have put there. She wrote the discretion into the story by what she chose not to say, and he saw her do it, and that was its own kind of vow. She wrote through the small hours at Achterberg's own desk, while Draco sat across from her in the firelight, and she did not write the penitent heir, and she did not write the redeemed villain, because both were stories, and she was done with stories. She wrote the man. She wrote show, don't tell the way she'd never been able to in 11 months of society puff. She wrote the rain held off her shoulder and onto his, the cruel letter kept to stay humble, the soil warmed for seedlings no camera would credit, the boy who had not spoken in 2 years saying one word into a coat. She did not say he is good. She laid the evidence in a row and let the reader arrive there with no help, the way she finally had herself. She wrote her own part into it too. That was the thing that made Achterberg sit forward halfway through the read. Hermione did not pretend to be the neutral investigator. She wrote that she had come to destroy this man and failed because there was nothing to destroy. She wrote that she had used a false name and a borrowed cynicism, and that both had been a kind of cowardice. She put herself in the story as the person who'd been wrong, publicly, in print, under her own name, because a confession from the woman who'd hunted him was the one thing Pruitt could never answer, the one move he couldn't follow. You understand what this does to you, Achterberg said when she'd finished reading. The editor took off her spectacles and rubbed the bridge of her nose. This isn't a redemption piece about Malfoy. It's a self-immolation. You're telling all of Britain that the great Hermione Granger spent a year hiding behind a fake byline, came out to ruin a man, and fell for him instead. They will never let you forget it. I know. You'll never write hard news in this country again without someone bringing it up. I know. Achterberg looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Draco, sitting silent in the firelight, watching Hermione spend the entire currency of her reputation on him with an expression of such naked, wrecked wonder that the editor's hard face softened by a fraction. "Well," Achterberg said, putting her spectacles back on, "it's the best thing you've ever written, and it'll sell out by noon, and I'd be a fool not to run it." She reached for her quill. Special edition, on the streets by 4, an hour ahead of Pruitt's Poison. She paused. "Granger, for what it's worth. I never believed you'd sold out for that Puff column. I always thought you were waiting for something worth burning it down for." She glanced at Draco again. "Seems you found it." They watched the special edition go out from the window of a coffee house across from the printing district in the grey of the morning, with the rain finally stopped and a thin, cold light coming up over the wet rooftops. The newsboys went out with their bundles. "The Man Behind the Mask" by Hermione Granger, and below it, smaller, the line that undid Pruitt entirely. An investigation that found the opposite of what it sought. By the time the Prophet's evening edition hit the streets at 5, every reader in Britain had already read hers. Pruitt's photograph, the hand at her face, the locked room, was no longer a scandal. It was simply a picture of 2 people the public had already been told the whole truth about, and a truth told plainly cannot be exposed. The insinuation had nothing left to insinuate. By the following morning, the Prophet was running a sullen, minimizing follow-up, and Pruitt, Achterberg told her later with grim satisfaction, was already being asked uncomfortable questions by the paper's own board about how he'd managed to get so thoroughly, so publicly, outmaneuvered by his own runaway reporter. But all that came later. In the grey morning, in the coffee house, with the special edition selling out across the street, and her career as she'd known it burning quietly behind her, Hermione turned from the window to find Draco looking at her. He had not said a word in an hour. He had watched her give away everything she'd spent a year trying to reclaim, watched her do it without flinching, watched her leave the box locked and tell the world only the truths that were hers to tell. And now he looked at her with an expression she had no name for, the mask gone so completely she wondered if it would ever come back. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely steady. "You did it," he said. "You burned it down. The secret. You spent your whole name on—" He stopped. "On a man who told you in the rain you'd never do it, who stood in his own house and accused you of choosing the lie." His jaw worked. "I was so certain. I have been certain my entire life that the moment it cost someone something to believe in me, they'd stop. Everyone always stops." He took a step toward her, across the narrow space, the way he had in the archive. "And you stood in front of all of Britain and didn't stop. I told you I'd show you," she said. Her own voice had gone unsteady now. "It was the only proof you'd accept, the kind that costs me something. It cost you everything. It cost me a reputation I'd already stopped wanting," she said. "And it got me—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. He was very close now. The coffee house had gone quiet around them, or perhaps she'd simply stopped hearing it. He lifted his hand, the same hand, the one that had been at her cheek when the camera came, the one she'd turned into an interview. And this time, it did not hover, did not tremble with the certainty of being rejected. It came to rest against her face, warm and sure, and his thumb moved once across her cheekbone. And there was no box between them now, and no Pruitt, and no false name, and no story left to write. Only the truth she had spent 11 months, and a fortnight, and an entire reputation arriving at. Hermione, he said, just her name, the real one. And she rose up the last fraction of an inch to meet him as he bent to her at last. No camera flashed, no bell tolled in a cold house, no door banged open on a man with a wound for a smile. There was only the grey morning light coming through the coffee house window, and the smell of rain-wet stone cooling toward dawn, and the warmth of his hand against her face, and then his mouth on hers. Careful at first, disbelieving, as though he expected even now to be taken back, to be left with empty air where she had been. She did not take it back. She answered him instead, her hand coming up to fist in the damp wool at his collar the way the boys had, holding on with the same wordless certainty of a creature that has found the one safe place in the world. And she felt the exact moment the disbelief went out of him, felt the careful, braced restraint give way all at once, the way his breath had gone out of him in the archive when she turned her face into his palm. Except deeper now, final, a thing released after 5 years of being held against the certainty of loss. His arms came around her. He kissed her like a man who had spent his whole life being told he could not have a single good thing and had just been handed one, and dared, finally, to close his hands around it. The kiss was not gentle, and it was not desperate. It was something rarer than either. It was honest. The first entirely honest thing to pass between two people who had each spent years performing a self for an audience that never wanted the truth. There was no version of it for the cameras. There was no story in it. There was only his mouth and her hands, and the small sound he made low in his throat when she pulled him closer, and the slow, unhurried gravity that had been drawing them together since a rain-soaked lane outside an orphanage, since a locked archive, since a gala where he'd said her name and dropped a mask he'd worn for years. When they finally drew apart, it was only far enough to breathe. His forehead came down to rest against hers. His hand stayed at her cheek. His eyes, when she opened her own, were wet, and he did not bother to hide it. And that, the not hiding, was the whole of it, she understood. The whole of what she'd given him, permission to be seen. "You're shaking," she said softly. "I know." A breath of something that was almost a laugh. "I've been waiting 5 years to find out what it felt like to be believed, and it turns out it feels like being terrified." His thumb moved over her cheekbone. "I don't know how to do this, any of it. I've spent so long maintaining the version of myself that's bearable to other people that I'm not certain there's anything underneath worth." "Stop." She pressed 2 fingers to his lips. "There's a man who warms soil for orphans no one will ever credit him for. There's a man who keeps the cruelest letter to stay humble. There's a man who sat on a cold floor in the dark until a silent child decided the world was safe enough to want things in." She held his eyes. "I've seen underneath, Draco. I went where you told me not to, because that's who I am, and I won't pretend otherwise. And what I found there wasn't something to expose. It was someone to..." She let the word come this time, the one that had hung unsaid in the archive, enormous. "To love. So stop telling me there's nothing worth loving. I've read the evidence. I'm very good at evidence." He shut his eyes. When he opened them, the fear had not gone. It would not go for a long time. She understood that. It was older than she was, and it would take years of patient unlearning. But beneath it, steadier now, was the thing she had watched crack open in the archive and widen in the rain, and finally take root. Belief. Not in himself, not yet, but in her, in the fact of her, in the impossible, evidenced front-page truth that someone had looked at the whole of him, every locked piece, and stayed. "All right," he said, very quietly. "All right." The fallout came as Achterberg had promised it would. It came for weeks. The Prophet's board, scrambling to outrun the disaster of Pruitt's outmaneuvering, opened an internal review that found, with the speed of an organization desperate to be seen finding it, that Cormac Pruitt had repeatedly run insinuation as fact and pressured reporters to manufacture stories the evidence did not support. He was gone within the month, his name a quiet byword in the trade for the man who'd been beaten on his own front page by the reporter he'd tried to ruin. Hermione did not gloat. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she felt nothing toward him at all, that the hunger which had driven her to the gala, the need to fill the hollow place with someone else's downfall, had simply gone, replaced by something that asked nothing of anyone's ruin. Her own reputation took the wound she'd known it would. There were those who said exactly what Achterberg had warned, that her judgment was compromised, that she'd been seduced by the subject, that the war heroine had thrown herself away on a Death Eater and disgraced a year of her own deception in the process. She let them say it. She had spent 11 months hiding behind a false name to be thought well of, and she found that being thought badly of for the truth sat far easier on her than being admired for a lie ever had. Draco had been right about that, in the rain, with his shoulder going dark with water held for her sake. At least the hatred would be honest. It was. And honest weight is bearable in a way that comfortable falsehood never is. But there were others too, and more of them than the loud voices suggested. Letters came to the Sentinel, addressed to her, from people the Prophet had never thought to ask, from families who had received anonymous reparations and never known whom to thank. From the matron in Halifax, 3 lines in a careful hand. "He came when he said he would. You wrote it true. Thank you for letting him stay him." From strangers who said, in their various imperfect words, that they had not known it was possible for a person to change so completely, and that reading it had made them braver about their own buried hope that they might. She read everyone. She read them aloud to Draco in the evenings, in the rooms of the manor that was slowly being unmade and remade, the demolished drawing room now an empty, bright space with the windows thrown open. And she watched him learn, letter by letter, the thing the box behind the green brass clasp had taught him to disbelieve, that he could be known, all of him, and not be left. A year on. The garden at the Halifax orphanage had knit. The seams in the turf had vanished. The young plants along the south wall had come into their first real season, leggy and green and reaching. The glass house held a riot of seedlings in clumsy hand-labelled rows, and at the centre of the disorder, on a Saturday in early spring, a man knelt in the warmed soil with his sleeves pushed up and a streak of compost across one cheekbone, showing a boy how to ease a root-bound seedling out of its pot without tearing the roots. The boy talked now. Not constantly. He was still a quiet child, and some silences in him would never fully heal. But he talked, and he laughed, a high, unguarded sound, and he argued with the man about whether the tomatoes wanted more water or less. And the man took the argument seriously, the way he took everything Thomas said seriously, because he understood better than anyone alive what it had cost the boy to start wanting things again. Hermione watched them from the glass house door. She was not J. Marsh. She had not been J. Marsh in a year, and she would never be again. She wrote under her own name now, for the Sentinel, the kind of patient, evidence-built stories she'd been made for. The unglamorous truths that did not sell scandal, but slowly, story by story, changed what people were willing to believe about each other. It did not pay as the Prophet had. It did not put her on the front page most weeks. She had never in her life been happier with her work, because every word of it was true, and every word of it was hers. Draco looked up from the seedlings and found her in the doorway, and something in his face did the thing it still did, a year on, every single time, eased and warmed and opened, the last of the gala mask long gone, packed away with a self he no longer needed. He did not perform happiness for her. He simply was in front of her, without armour, and let her see it, and the letting was still the most that had ever been said. "You're letting them flood the tomatoes," she said. "Thomas insists. I'm deferring to local expertise." He rose, brushing soil from his knees, and crossed the small green room to her, and the boy went on with his earnest overwatering, perfectly content to be left to his disaster. "You came earlier than you said. I finished the piece." She tilted her face up as he reached her, the gesture habitual now, no longer brave, simply hers. "Acterberg's running it Sunday, the one about the Foundation's school in Cardiff." She paused. "I left your name out of it. Again. I noticed you do that." His hand came to rest at her cheek, the same hand, the gesture worn smooth now by a year of use, and his thumb moved over her cheekbone, and there was compost on it, and she did not care in the slightest. "Leave me out where it counts. You're the only journalist in Britain who knows the truth about me, and the only one who's never once used it." His mouth curved. "It's a very strange thing to be loved by a reporter. It's a very strange thing to love one's subject," she said. "I've made my peace with the scandal of it." He laughed. The real one, the low, unguarded sound she had spent a fortnight at the start, convinced was a performance, and now knew, past any doubt, was the truest thing he owned. And he bent and kissed her in the doorway of the glass house, unhurried, with the spring light coming green through the glass, and the boy's contented muttering behind them, and a year of evidence between them that the whole of him could be seen and stayed for. There was no one to perform it for, no camera, no headline. No public truth and private one, not anymore. Only the single ordinary truth of two people who had armoured themselves against being known and had, against everything they each were certain of, let themselves be seen. When they finally parted, his forehead came down to hers, and he breathed out slow and steady, the breath of a man who had stopped waiting to be left. "Stay," he said. The boy's word, their word now, the only one that mattered. "I'm staying," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." And she didn't.
Thank you for staying with this story until the end. I want to tell you why I wrote it. We all wear a mask. We show people that version of us that feels safe, and we are scared that if someone sees the real us, they will leave. Draco was scared of this too. He gave money to children in secret. He warmed the soil so seedlings could grow, but he never put his name on it. He thought no one would believe he was good, and Hermione came to prove he was a fake, but she found something else. She found a real person, and then she had to make a choice. She could write the story, or she could tell the truth and lose everything. There is one part I love the most. A small boy did not speak for 2 years. Draco did not force him to talk. He just sat with him in the dark, and one day the boy said the word. He said, "Stay." I think we all want that. We want someone to see the real us and stay anyway. So here is my small wish for you. I hope you find your person, the one who sees everything and does not leave. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself.